All right, and good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Nelson Centine. I'll be your host for this webinar in the series from BSI. Today, we're talking about stopping bot-enabled cyber attacks through behavioral biometrics. Glad to have you this afternoon as we engage on this webinar. Please, if you have any questions, please make sure that you use either the chat box or raise your hands as we go along. We want to make sure that this is a kind of participatory event. So if you have some comments or questions, glad to, for you to inject those and ask those as we go. If you want to hold those until the end, that's fine. We'll have a Q&A at the end. As always, this presentation will be made available, after we do a post-production. The video will be posted on YouTube, and we'll actually have the presentation on our website for you to download and read at your leisure. So with that said, let's just talk about some MFA credentials that can kill bots. And so the topic at hand is very important, and for many reasons. Cyber attacks have been alive and going on since we actually started having the internet. And the more commerce that we do on the internet, the more that we actually spend time in the digital world, the more money is transacted in this particular environment. And so one of the challenges that follows logically is that when credentials are compromised, when passwords are shared, there are billions of dollars that are at stake. And so this is actually something that is a huge flaw, or a huge business, if you will, for people who are malactors. They come in different forms. In some instances, we were talking here in credential sharing, or stealing straight up credentials and gaining access to accounts. Sharing the credentials takes many forms. We had a good blog last week talking about how Netflix and other entities like Adobe are actually just losing thousands of dollars, billions of dollars, if you will, in lost revenues when people share those assets. And so when it comes down to bot attacks, the problem is slightly different, but it ends up in the same thing. There are billions of dollars that the industry is losing because the machines, the bots, are able to replicate passwords, steal passwords, guess passwords, and gain access. And just to give you an idea, BSI has been engaged in the world of education. And so let's just take that vertical for comparison for one brief moment. And let's just take a look at something that has happened in recent years where through bot attacks, California actually just had 60,000 students, and I say that in air quotes, basically register for community colleges, right? And so if you do some quick math, if you think that, there was $1,000 or $5,000 per tuition in education for these faked accounts, the numbers is quickly into the $60 to $300 million, in one single event. And for the most part, these events don't take a lot of publicity because there's not a lot of publicity in these events because the accounts are kind of scared about, basically raising their hand and saying, oh gosh, we were subject to a bot attack. So it happened in the state of California. It has happened in other places like in Texas. And so it comes in different flavors. If you remember last year, towards the end of the year, Uber actually just had an attack that began as a hacking attack, but then had an element of a bot, which was more egregious because the bot attack happened to take place towards their PAM, the privileged access management software, where the really important software passwords are. And so this is something, again, that is of impact on revenue, on safety. Imagine a bot attack gaining control of a key element in infrastructure, whether it's water management, whether it is actually air traffic control. It can become a serious problem. So this is something that is happening, and it has happened for a while, and it is becoming more prevalent. And so it all starts from the element of credential sharing. It manifests itself in the forms of identity theft or takeover, ransomware, robot attacks. And so today we're going to follow on follow the category of the yellow categories here. When you have bot attacks that basically work through an account to do an account takeover, commercial fraud, and or also the internet bot attacks, right? And so this is a function of the fact that multi-factor authentication, as we know it today, is just not a complete solution. There's just no easy way of saying it. The crass way would have been to say it's broken, but just to put it in polite technical terms, it's just not a complete solution, right? And it's because we humans can just work around them. We work in patterns, we share information. And so if you can imagine, that somebody in your family or at some point you have said, I'm going to share with you my access to my Netflix account, to my Hulu account. Or if you're in a corporate environment, we've all seen the marketing team sharing, for example, Adobe as an example we had just already mentioned. And as we get more in more sophisticated environments, basically you can replicate credentials or guess them. And at some point, if you steal a piece of a personal piece of information, then you can guess other components. So you can compromise the multi-factor authentication process. And so again, it's a process that it does its best. It provides a great level of security, but it's still, compromised. And so the argument here is, okay, what could we do to actually plug that hole of MFA as it regards, to bot attacks? And how do we focus on specifically in this briefing, on how to stopping the replication? So let's just expand and get into that. The first question is to say, okay, let's just define a bot attack. And so to the audience, just so we can get some activity, does anybody want to raise their hand and say, you know what, this is what I would consider to have a bot attack? And you want to give an example? No, it's not required. I'm not going to make a big deal of it. But if anybody wants to raise their hand, I don't see anybody. Let's just basically give a brief definition so we can do a level set. And let's just look at a bot attack as an attack in which there's a script, there's a piece of code that has been written. And it is, it's a designer fashion, right? There's a specific code that has been written for us to actually just accomplish a mission, right? And typically, or most commonly can be in the form of like somebody stuffing passwords into a challenge window, right? Something that, we can just replicate and again, go through a repetitive pattern through brute force until we get access into account, right? So we're going to define here as just an attack that is based out of running a script or software that happens to be designed for a specific purpose to basically breach into an element of security. And so one of the most common ways to see this is into your typical SaaS provider window. So where you come into, you have a pop-up window and basically you have to type in your name and your password. And so you go through the exercise of typing your email, and then there's going to be a password, right? And so in the typical or most simple form of bot attacks, this happens automatically. Some piece of information has been stolen, some of other information has been guessed. And so, the bot, gains access, the access is turned over to the malactor. Next thing you know, you're off to the races trying to chase your money because somebody's siphoning it all off, right? And so let's just basically just narrow this down because there's plenty of bot attacks. And I just gave an example, but let's just talk about what are the most common types of these bot attacks. So let's pick 4 of these, and again, there may be other examples. We're just going to focus on these briefly, and then we're going to taper it down to the ATOs and transactional frauds. But the first one is scraping. And this is one of those attacks that is somewhat insidious because it just happens all of the time in the normal course of business. And so when you're talking about scraping, imagine that you have bots that actually just go and crawl through the web and basically gain information from websites. And this happens all of the time. Google does it, and Bing does it, and all of the search engines do this. They literally go through our websites and get information as far as what is the code looking for, what are the different key elements in the code. And this is for positive action, right? They're just want to, in this particular case, the bots want to look for a better way to render the information for the user. But of course, in typical fashion for the malactors, they can take this technology and just turn it on ourselves and use it for nefarious purposes. So they begin to basically ask questions or scrape from the website. How are we looking for challenges? What is the sequence in which a particular code or challenge is organized? And this is important because this begins to build a pattern of behavior that then the bot can go out and exploit. If you're looking for a typical website that is scraped all the time, you will have your Amazon, you'll have your Hulu, you would have your eBay, places where you have multiple transactions and you want to follow the same pattern. Those are prime candidates to go through scraping. And don't underestimate the fact that if you're protecting something important on your website is being scraped for beneficial purposes, but also for negative purposes. Another example of a bot attack is actually what's known as a DDoS, or a denial of service. This is actually just going back to the original attacks. And if you go back to the early 2000s, this was actually a very notorious way to actually just block access to a particular website. And so it has a nefarious purpose if in fact what you're trying to do is take down the competition or take down a website for a specific purpose, right? And deny access to others that may want to conduct business. If you're able to do this and the website that you're tackling derives its income or revenue through interaction with the users, you're costing them billions of dollars. And again, they use a similar technique in here, in which perhaps there's an area that is actually secure, or there's an area where you may have a cart. And what happens in here is that you overwhelm the system by repeatedly asking for tags, clicks, submissions, and for all of those activities that are going to tax the engine that sits behind the website. So another common form is the denial of service, or the DDoS. This is, again, going back to old school. Let's now look at a more relevant one, for the purposes of the webinar. And so let's just talk about an account takeover. And so in the account takeover, something that happens is, a piece of the information has been lost. And so in this particular case, an email has been compromised. And so the machine takes that email and goes back and forth and just continues to basically submit this application to your challenge. And so we've evolved, and of course, now we have different elements that, we're going to talk about those. But in this particular form, it is just basically where a piece of information has been compromised. And then what happens is the machines and the people that work together to help the bot attacks are guessing elements that come with that piece of information and that they've been putting together to build a profile, and just keep on taking the best guesses until they actually hack it. So this is another one of those critical, ways of where a bot attack can take a website. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into this one. And the last one in the series, just to mention, is a transactional fraud. And so this one is a slightly different one, in which you start in the same spot, which is somebody has lost a piece of information. Sometimes it is the PIN to a credit card, or something may be like the number of the credit card combined with your name or address. And the malactors begin to gather this information and actually just build a profile on you. Once they have enough information, and specifically in the action here where we're talking about a financial account, they basically prepare all of the profiles, and they basically go to multiple websites at the same time, so that you can just in a coordinated fashion through a net or a neural web of, if you will, of bots, attack the financial sites at the same time, and just hope that you can actually just get one of the codes to work. Thousands of sites, when you have thousands of permutations, you're bound to have good odds of hacking. And so the key element here is that you're basically tackling at the same time to avoid basically giving yourself up. So it's all synchronized. And the fact that it works, because typically the elements that you're guessing when you have reduced the information are just elements that are just small variables, like the pins or the special secret codes that people ask you all the time, those three-letter number or three-digit numbers. Those are the elements where we find the biggest fracture. And so it all boils down to scraped information and just being able to guess a finite set of data. Okay. So let's go ahead and focus ourselves into the ATOs and the transactional bot attacks. And so what are the things that happen, and how do we actually just manage those? Common elements, as you heard me just allude already, is number one is they depend largely on the predictability of use. And this is really important when we talk about how do we defeat them. So if I can predict how I'm using the password technology, if I can predict how I'm using the MFA, then I can actually just automate the process and just go through all of the possible permutations until I hit the right jackpot, if you will. So looking at patterns of use, also looking at the number of characters and the input choices. So when you have predictability into what is the expected number of, for example, digits in a PIN. If I say your PIN, you immediately think of 4 numbers. If I say a security code, you immediately think of 3 numbers, unless, you talk about American Express and they're like the odd man out, if you will, out there. So there are strong patterns that basically allow you to basically fit into a box that can be exploited when you use finite choices. Also, the fact that, for example, if you have a PIN, when you look at the input device, you go 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you follow that sequence, right? So those are things that, that become vulnerabilities into how the simplicity of the design on one side compromises the security on the other end. So that's one. On the other end, you have the input mechanics. And so we spoke about, a few of these already. So if you have a mouse pad, if you have a touchpad, if you have a keypad, right, you're basically working with the codes that you have. So if you have a PIN, like when you go to the ATM and you have 10 digits and 2 special codes, well, those are the combinations that you have to use. That's your finite set. So when you see in the movie somebody sticking a card into a machine, that's a cyber attack. If you basically just run it through the codes, you can hear it in your head, right? Those are just the codes permutating until basically you just crack the code. And so, yes, we have taken elements to actually just prevent this from happening for the machines to recognize it, but that's level of sophistication where you can actually do these things in a way that you can fool the security system. And so how can we avoid this from happening so that we don't even have to be in the same arena? So input mechanics is another factor. And the last piece, and we've heard me talk about already as I go through the slides, is the fact that at some point somebody had to be collecting some of this information and begin to build a profile that can be then exploited for use. So this could be as simple as your login name and typically some other elements that have your PII, your personal identifiable information. So if you look here on the screen, I'm actually just using some of the things that come immediately to mind. But if you're looking at passwords and pieces of information that people can guess, I'm going to have my birthday in my password, right? I'm going to have my high school year graduation, in my email or in my login information, right? I'm going to use 2 or 3 of my initials, right? The year of my birth, the month of my birth, right? And so the fact that we're basically using an alphabet, if you will, that has 26 letters, 10 digits, and 33 special characters, and that's it, right? That's a limited set. So these are the things that are exploited because the machines and the bots and the coders can predict that you're going to be following those rules of this is my data set. I'm going to enter it into this way, and I already have some pieces of information, so I don't have to guess the complete puzzle, right? To actually just land this information and to give you some additional perspective, let's just look at the repetition and predictability, right? And so here on the board, it's basically the elements of like, what is repetition? Well, we're looking for a pattern. We're looking for a pattern within patterns, right? We're looking for sequences and entry and the validation steps, and so these are just the things that are easy for computers to actually scrape off to guess. I mean, if everybody has heard about ChatGPT, I don't think that you can actually just read the newspaper, open up the web, your TikTok, if you're so inclined, and actually just not be hit by something that talks about ChatGPT. So that is pattern recognition, a little bit clearly more sophisticated because it gets to the level of AI, but it all begins with pattern recognition. And why does that happen? Well, it happens because the letters that we use are in codes. So if I'm looking for a capital A, that's the code right there in binary, or you can be using hex, if you want to do it like that way. So all of the letters, have a pattern. And at some point, the computers can look for something like this, and in a second be like, oh yeah, I know what that is. That is actually just equals hello, because the way that that code is transferred is actually hello. And so you can look over here, and if you look at this word, the first thing, if you're looking at the numbers, take a moment. So you have there, the 5 letters, right? It immediately jumps at you that there's a repetition on the last on 2 letters there, right? The L's. So you don't know what they are, but you know that that's a repetition, right? So that's how you begin to look and collect the data and begin to predict, okay, so when I see a pattern that repeats itself, then you can just build and actually exploit. This is the most basic element of repetition and exploitation, where you can look for patterns and patterns within patterns. And it all happens because we are, working with characters that are ASCII based that use these particular codes, right? And so even if it's encrypted, even if my key is encrypted, right, you're subject to the fact that somebody can steal that code and somebody can guess it, right? And so that's actually just one of the fundamental elements of like challenge that we can say, if repetition and predictability is a problem, what can we do about it, right? So what could we do if we were not forced to use these? Okay, sticking with the patterns, right? Let's go from the data itself. Let's go then to other kinds of patterns. And so let's just say that we have bounded inputs, right? So you have a limited set of characters. So I just said, when you look at the codes over here, you have 26 letters, and you might have 10 digits, and you might have 23 special characters. That's a very finite set. If you use another language or another alphabet, Cyrillic, kanji or the likes, right? You have more codes out there, but you still may have a finite set. So when you have bound inputs, it basically allows the computers and the bots to solve the problem, decode the password, a lot faster because it's a limited set. And you can then do this within the windows where the security software flags you for suspicious activity. Again, you have characters also that are language specific. And so if you're working with folks that are in the United States, typically you can guess that their passwords would be in English. If you basically look at people that actually just raise their hand and say, hey, I'm Puerto Rican, then you can guess that some passwords will be in Spanish. So when you're looking at the codes and the repetition, and you look at the bound sets of words that you have in the language, then you can begin to look at, how a code is cracked. The other element, again, is back to the number of data entry points. I'm showing here your typical password, or PIN box, for your ATM. If you go to a POS on your supermarket or hotel to actually just make a withdrawal on an ATM, these are just the choices that you have. And you notice that the way that the computer takes the input is sequentially. So it's not like you can actually just jump to a window. You have to go, if your pin is 1, 2, 4, 6, you have to enter the 1, then the 2, then the 4, and then the 6. You cannot go 1, 6, 4, 2. That's just the way that the input works. And so the computer actually just does the same thing if you're limited in the number of inputs. That's just what bounded means, right? So you're forced to follow a sequence. What if we could actually just not be bound like that and completely foil the approach of the XML actors? And so this brings us to the last piece of the puzzle, which is, okay, for all of this to work, you're going to have to get some consolidated data that is going to be compromised, right? So you're scraping all of this information, you're beginning to sift it, you're beginning to use the smart algorithms, and you begin to classify and look for patterns, right? And so to some folks may look like disparate pieces of data, but what the malactors are doing, they're building a puzzle so that they can only focus on the pieces that are left, right? The things that they can go and hack. So just trying to move the conversation, as we're looking at the way that bots do work for an account takeover or a transactional attack, some key elements are then the repetition, then the limited number of inputs, and then the fact that you got to have compromised data. So in the simplest of forms, if we were going to basically defeat this, then we basically take the opposite approach, right? So what if we could inject some randomness that is unique into the passwords that we use? Or what if we could have an unlimited number of inputs and still be able to get the work done? Or what if we could actually just transact without carrying some personal identifiable information, right? If we're not giving up the information, then it cannot be used against us. If we basically just do it in the blind, right? If we have an unlimited set of choices, then we can frustrate or become a deterrent because it's too tough to solve, and if we inject some randomness, then again, back to the issue of time, you can thwart, the attack by just basically just exceeding the time that it takes for the computer to solve the problem within the window security. And so back to the MFA, right? Classical MFA has 3 factors, right? Knowledge, possession, and inherence, right? Something that I know that I have. And all those things can be shared, stolen, and replicated with the exception of inherence, which is linked to biometrics. When you're looking at new factors that are basically just being brought into bear so we can actually foil these attacks and others, right? You come into the area of ability, which typically can't be shared, stolen, or replicated. It's really tough to do, again, within those times that you're allowed to solve a problem. Randomness, again, sometimes it can be shared, sometimes the random generators can be stolen, rarely ever replicated. So these are just new factors that are coming in for us to break out, and just be able to foil the bot attack. And so let's move into, okay, how can we use behavioral biometrics, specifically signature biometrics, to exploit these vulnerabilities of our bot attacks, right? So the first thing to think of is that when we're looking at behavioral biometrics, and specifically just going to the main topic of the solution that we're pitching today, it's just like, hey, it's about the passwords that you can write. And it has nothing to do with the calligraphy, right? It's not an issue of how can I make a really beautiful password. If I wanted to do that, I will get myself a really nice pen, just parchment paper, and just going to do that. Has nothing to do with how pretty it is, or even if I can just kind of like, make it a nice readable password. Doesn't have to be anything like that. It's the fact that you're writing, you're just creating a password that is really hard for other person to replicate. And it goes into the mathematical impossibility or the strength of the solution to be able to do that. So we're going to dive into that one. It's an easy password to remember. It could be something like your name, your signature, and again, the solution here is like something that is really hard, to replicate. It's all based on the math, right? And so when you go into this element, into the like writing your password and drawing it, the odds and the mathematical equations behind it make the odds of you being able to break this in any bot machine in the billions to 1, quickly into the trillions to 1. And so, sure, if you have a great supercomputer that you can take with you to actually just hack your local ATM machine or to basically hack your website, yeah, you can probably go through that. But typically what happens is, the system's triggered when you make a complex problem, try to be solved in a finite amount of time. And again, this is an issue where you can have the same password. So I can show you here example number 1, example number 2, example number 3. It's the same word, it's the same password. But when you're trying to put together, it has some similarities, right? And it's really hard to replicate. And so people think, well, Nelson, what if I compare the pictures? Is that what we're doing? What we're talking about is here is just completely different. It's not comparing pictures, right? It's something, that is related to more than this, into the unique way into which you would basically write your password. And so I'm going to ask you in the audience right now, take a moment and close your eyes. And as you're listening to my voice, with your hand, imagine that you're drawing your signature. Okay, and just close your eyes, you move your hand, you're doing your signature, and you can all of a sudden realize, yep, I just drew my signature. Rarely ever, except if you heard this question before, have you thought, how many strokes did it take me to do this? What was the path that I chose? What was the order and the sequence? And how did I put together? And so that is actually a puzzle, that is slightly different because we're not scanning images here. We're not talking about basically looking at images or comparing pictures against pictures. It's truly how do I look at the way that I'm moving is being built as I'm just drawing my password or just writing it, right? And that becomes a really hard problem for to be solved, right? When you're looking from that element, a signature that was just very straightforward behind, the machine looks at it in different segments and different orders, right? And inherently has randomization. It has uniqueness that is linked to the user, and it all depends into how this is done, right? Because when I'm writing this password, I could have written PZBN in any particular sequence. I could have broken down these letters, as you can see here, the P in 4 segments, and still make it look the same way, but the computer is registering this after the fact in the sequence. So this is a more complex math problem that is just really simple to do, and at the same time, super robust. And it all hinges into, again, being random, inherently owned by the user, and is really tough to do. So this becomes a deterrent. And so to move the conversation and just to kind of like take it into a different angle here, this is where you have the proverbial difference between fighting the fight and just that your opponent wants you to fight and doing something different, right? Everybody has seen this analogy. And people talk about, hey, listen, somebody was playing checkers, somebody was playing chess, right? And quickly you can get into the conversation and miss the point because some people will argue, well, my password is better than yours. My password, on biometric security signatures, that's not what I'm talking here. Okay, for all intents and purposes, listen, I'm a firm believer in physical biometrics. I'm a firm believer in using one-time codes, all of those elements, right? What I'm talking about, and here's the fact that if the bots are expecting you to have a sequence and a finite set of factors, I'm just going to play a different game altogether. So if they're playing chess, I'll play checkers. Again, if we're playing a different game, then we're basically foiling the opponent, right? And this goes back to the fundamentals of defense, which is dominate the terrain. If anybody here is a big fan of the Sun Tzu, right? Always fight on your own terms. Take the fight to a place that you can control. And that's what we're talking about in here, where we're talking about foiling bot attacks, right? How do we do this, right? We are going to use technology that is actually unique, that actually just, helps us use an infinite set of choices, right? And it's actually just free and devoid of personal markers that can actually be used to scrape and use against you at a later time. When you do these things, right, you achieve the factors that you saw in the previous slide, which is I want my password to be unique. I want my input to be actually just unlimited. And then I want to make sure that I carry no PII. And so I'm going to take the liberty here just to talk about as an example of technology that's out there. Shameless plug for biometric signature ID. We do have software solutions that actually just can break the bot. And so we do this by using what we call advanced MFA, right? Take us as an example. And so just, take the brand away. When you're talking about behavioral biometrics, there's an element that goes beyond just, the physical biometric, but it's actually just to the way that you do things, the things that are just linked to your persona, right? Knowing a password, having a control. So all of those are elements of MFA that you can have, right? And then it just hinges on some elements of ability and actually the uniqueness of your state of mind that make a big difference, that it's different, right? That is just not what the computer on the other end is expecting, that boutique code is trying to hack into. And so when you look and take this approach, right, when you have a solution that is all into one, for example, and that it has some odds of randomness that are just 192 billion to 1, and that is, again, at the lowest level, right? I'm glad to go through the math and just show you how that works into. I mean, this could be quickly into the trillions to 1, so it becomes a really deterrent. And so it happens because when you're looking at the way that this password, or as an example, works, right? Let's say that you have the window here for your PIN, 4 numbers, and in your mind, you immediately go like 1, 2, 3, 4, and we just kind of going to type in the keyword, right? When you're doing this, notice that you can actually just write the numbers in any particular sequence, and you can actually just draw the numbers, if you will, in any way. So the 1, the A, the M, capitals, lower cases, right? And these are just not only a set of characters, but imagine that it's an unlimited set of fonts, just to kind of like take that approach. And beyond that, it's not just that it's unlimited number of fonts, because I don't want you to think of like limited ASCII codes, because all of those are repeatable codes. It's that the way that you write is unique. the way that you write your signature, the way that you write a word is unique to Nelson, is unique to Jeff, is unique to Rachel, to everybody here, in the presentation. And so this is actually another example of a password that is nearly impossible to hack other than myself, the one person that I actually just generate. So it means that I'm the only person that can actually just generate and pass this code. So that's a signature, something that is really simple, and again, it's so robust. It is kind of makes you scratch your head, right? So this is an example of how the signatures, written passwords can actually solve the challenges that we have when you have data that is predictable, bound, and can be guessed, because what you're doing is you're completely taking the fight to a different angle. You're shifting the element and shifting the conversation to go from something that is repeatable, something that can be guessed, into something that is random, cannot be guessed, and is really hard to replicate. And so just wanted to share with you this afternoon, actually, what we think about is a good solution to actually just stop bots from hacking into automated systems. We've actually just proven to be successful in doing this. And again, just taking the brand away, it's one of those elements from a cybersecurity aficionado, if you will, to another. These are just the elements that we would like to see going forward, so we can actually thwart bot attacks. And so with that, I think I'm at my half-hour mark, speaking. I'll open up for questions, from the team. Any questions from the floor? Anything in chat? Any questions that anybody would like to add? I see that, Walter, you're trying to come off of mute.
Yeah, I'm getting terrible feedback. You probably can't hear me.
Okay, fair enough. No worries. Great. I don't see anybody else with any particular additional questions, but anybody in the chat, anybody on the microphones, one go around as far as questions. I hope that this has been actually just, somewhat of a thought-provoking way to start thinking about ways to defeat the bots using behavioral biometrics, and more specifically biometrics that you can write. If you want to learn more about it, you can actually just visit us at biosig-id.com, where you can actually just, in there in the website, just look for additional examples on how these behavioral biometrics can do this. And so I see here that we have a question. It says, freeform versus constrained boxes. Can you describe in more detail? Okay, so yeah, so let's just basically go into freeform versus constrained boxes, and let me just go back over here.
And while you're doing that, Nelson, I think that's a great call out, right? I think the freeform signature versus the 4 fields that you have here on your screen, I think could be used in lieu of like a DocuSign, right? That would be something similar as far as a similar product to compare to.
Well, a little bit beyond that. So thanks for teeing that up. And so, for example, this is actually an example of what seems to be a constrained input. So actually, let's go back to this one here and start with a clear example of constrained input. So you can see this slide, I have a POS. And in the POS, you have, for example, if you're challenged with a PIN, the PIN that is mostly requested is actually a PIN in 4 characters. And those characters have to be entered left to right in our world. And so you have to enter them in sequence. So if it's a code of 1, 2, 3, 5, or 5, 4, 3, 2, you have to type in those numbers and they fall into place in sequence as expected. But your PIN, if you look at it, it is actually just, discretely 1, 3, 5, 4. If you basically use a particular approach like this, where you still have 4 numbers on a PIN, and you're actually now basically using a system like this, if you can see my cursor or imagine it, I can start writing from the left, from the right, on the far right, and then move my way to the left. That is a completely unexpected move that happens with software solutions like the ones we're offering. So you literally just confuse the bot because they're expecting left to right, you're going right to left. If you're looking at the next level of confusion as well, I can go from the center, to the outside. So I can go 2, 3, 1, 4, and it's a completely random application there. Again, I'm randomizing the way that I'm entering my code, and that makes a difference as far as how the bot is basically looking for the input and the solution, because the bot is collecting the first, second, third, and fourth input independent of what that position is. If you remember the game, not Battleship, but Mastermind, this is where, you would I have 4 right codes, but they're in the wrong place. And so trying to solve that problem becomes much more complex. That said, it's a different element of complexity when you go from this four areas of input, if you will, when you go into a single signature. And so let me see if I can explain this a little bit better. When you're trying to compare signatures, right? Most people go immediately to the comparison of one picture against the other one. So where it looks on something like this. So I take a picture and I stack and I'm like, okay, what is the difference? You know, what's the delta into this JPEG, right? And that is a fairly simple problem to solve because I can just look at the pixels and realize, okay, DocuSign compares signatures and it looks close enough, right? The behavioral biometrics that are used and what we're talking about here is a completely different problem. It's truly a mathematical set of equations that basically look at the sequence of your strokes, the number of your strokes, the pressure, the speed, the gap in between them, and just converts this image that you see, you know, into a hash, you know, or an equation. And that is the piece that is completely unexpected to the bots because the bots are looking for this. The bots are looking for a code that will look something like, let's see if I can just show you here. The bots are looking for this, ones and zeros, right? You know, and a word that they can just reproduce. The hash, you know, on a string that's a mathematical equation looks completely random in numbers. So it looks like gibberish to the algorithm that's trying to solve it. And so they're playing checkers, you're playing chess. Hell, you're playing ping pong, they're playing pickleball or tennis, right? It's a completely different game on where you're solving or how you're solving that problem. Did I just yes or no on the box? I'm glad to go into further detail, but that's the difference between a constraint versus a free form, where I would have to guess, you know what my password is. Again, just even the way that I just organize my signature is different, and so I could give you my password. You could be able to put an image, but it's not an image comparison. It's just a formula on how that movie comes together. Good question. Appreciate it. Glad to actually just expand those and answer more questions as we go. Again, you know, applications where this is actually super important. I mean, if you're looking at the certification of documents, if you're looking at certification of transactions, you know, if you're looking at even just exactly the topic that we're talking about today, foiling a bot attack, it's just trying to go through brute force and repetition. But when you're repeating something that is nonsensical to the code that you're trying to hack, I mean, again, they're serving you ones and zeros, and you're expecting to have, I'm expecting a completely different hash. You know, it's again something really difficult for the bots to do. That's where the deterrence comes in. They get foiled and they actually just migrate away. So that's actually just, you know, one of the key elements of defeating the bots, making it difficult or impossible. We just happen to check both boxes. Okay. Any last questions? You know, last minute alibis. I appreciate the questions. Love to actually field more questions. And again, I'll make sure that this presentation is available to everybody on the website. You know, also have the video of the and recording of the session available on our YouTube channel. And so if there are no other questions, last minute alibis, I appreciate then you actually taking the time to actually join me this afternoon. I hope that you have a fantastic Easter weekend. This is Nelson Santini signing off on behalf of BSI. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.